Hey friends. Okay, so now that we've talked about materials and fasteners, let's talk about the basic connections, the basic joints, joinery for wood, and then we'll talk about scenic construction of flats, which are the walls, right, in our scenery layout, okay? So to begin with, and this is in chapter 10 in the book, to begin with, we have three types of cuts on stick lumber in this example, okay? So a rip cut goes with the grain of that lumber. A cross cut goes against the grain, so perpendicular to the grain of the wood. And then a miter cut is at any angle, although typically we're looking at like a 45-degree angle in a miter. But any angle to the direction of the grain. And the reason this is important is because that grain direction gives us a lot of the strength of the wood, right? And so we consider that as we move forward through this process, right? As we attach wood together. So the basic wood joints we have, a butt joint is two pieces of wood that just butt into each other, right? A lap joint is where those two pieces of wood overlap. And then a half lap is where you remove part of each piece of wood so that they overlap halfway into each other and kind of lock together. So those are the basic ones. When we're constructing, we're typically using mostly a butt joint, right? Where the two pieces of wood connect to each other in this way and then are attached with some sort of fastener as well as glue. The other one that you may find is a scab covering two longer pieces of wood. This allows you to extend wood, right? So the wood from the lumberyard only comes so long, and if you need a longer piece, you would scab over that joint by overlapping it on both sides with that scab covering, okay? So sometimes you'll see that. Sometimes we'll do that in order to reinforce a joint where it's two ends pointing to each other, right? We overlap another piece of wood. That's called scabbing that joint. There are lots of beautiful, pretty types of furniture joints. And if you get deep into woodworking, you'll use some of these because they are nice and strong and they're good for permanent work and they're beautiful, right? You don't have that visual overlap in the same way, and you still have a stronger joint, and you don't necessarily even have to use fasteners, right? Because of the way that these joints are constructed, right? So you can use like a dado joint where you cut a notch out, so it's kind of like that half lap, except it's in the middle of the piece of wood, and you cut out a notch, and that seats the other piece of wood into that notch. You can use a mortise and tenon joint where you have a hole that is the exact size, the mortise, and then you shave down the end of the other piece of wood so that it locks into that, so that the tenon side locks into that mortise. And you can do these nice, beautiful dovetails, right, where you've basically woven together the end of the wood into this really lovely joint, right? All of these require a lot of patience and you know, you can either chisel these or you can shave them using different power tools, but they are a little bit trickier to execute and they're not fast. So if you're making, you know, the chest that your child is going to pass down to the next generation, it makes sense to do this. And if you're making a flat that's going to be on stage for 3 weeks and then destroyed, it does not make sense to do this way. So that's why we don't typically use them. We usually really do stick with the butt joints, maybe a lap joint sometimes, right? And so that's what we'll be talking about when we talk about construction. So now let's talk about flats, okay? Flats are your walls, the walls, right? And we have a bunch of different construction methods, really two major construction methods, although they can come in lots of different forms, right? So when we are looking at flats, we might have a soft covered flat, a hard covered flat. You might have a specific profile cut out of that flat. You might have flat jacks. Those are the little braces on the back. They're not necessarily little, but they're the braces on the back of the flats that hold them up, right? the concept of the flat jack is that you would screw this tall part to the frame of the flat, and then you would throw some weight or screw this L brace down to the stage, and that keeps that wall up without it having to have perpendicular walls holding it together. So those are flat jacks. And they also allow you to move them around relatively easily. So let's talk about those two main types, right? We have a soft covered flat whose little words got a little smushed. We have the soft covered flat, that's the Broadway flat, right? These were the original style that were built for the theater. And it's basically a frame, a flat frame with a fabric cover on it. So it's almost like a giant canvas. And we have to use what are called corner blocks, right? So corner blocks and keystones over those joints. And then, and that's a keystone. So a corner block and a keystone holding together 1x3, which is a lightweight pine typically that we're using. And then the fabric is stretched over that whole piece. Okay. So that is your soft covered flat. The hard covered flat, and these boards are going the wide direction, right? So you can have and that's because you need to attach all that fabric, and you're gluing the fabric to the surface of the board going in the wide direction, okay? Hard covered flats or Hollywood flats use your 1x3 boards on edge. So instead of going flat, they're on their edges to frame a piece of luan, which is a thin plywood, okay? Which you know because you watched that whole materials video, right? So you have your plywood covering, and then the 1x3 boards hold that up and give it structure so that you can attach those panels together to create longer walls. You can attach them up and down to each other, and otherwise arrange them vertically in space. These were called Hollywood flats because they were initially built for Hollywood sets. Some of the standards of construction for Hollywood are a little bit different. If you actually work in the film industry, we typically don't put in as many braces as they do. So in actual film settings, your Hollywood flats will have braces every 2 feet. And we do it about 4 feet in theater. So that's just like an example of slight differences between our construction styles. But in the end, it's still the same idea, which is 1x3 boards on edge with a plywood cover over that. Okay. So a little bit more about our soft covered Broadway flats, right? Here are your parts of a flat frame. You want to draw this little sketch in your notes, because this will come back for you, right? So we have rails, and these are true in both soft and hard covered flats, these terms, right? So your rails are the top and bottom pieces of wood. Your stiles are the verticals, and then a toggle is that little brace in the center, okay? You'll also have a corner brace, typically on a soft covered flat. And you'll have what we noted just before. We noted these corner blocks and keystones. Those are like scabs that help strengthen the joints between all of these pieces of wood, okay? The reason you need a toggle on a soft covered flat, right, is that sometimes you'll find that the boards are bowing, etc. So, right, remember bowing is when the wood cups just over time or because of cutting it, right? And the toggle keeps that square by bracing the center of that frame, okay? You'll also know that you use these diagonals, right? So this is the corner brace, right? A diagonal brace piece. And that prevents this situation from happening, right? So this flat can become this, not rectangular anymore, right? You can see it sort of shifting. And that is prevented by putting in a triangular piece or a corner brace. When you've kept one corner square, it will keep all the other 3 corners square, right? You can't squish this rectangle anymore once you have that diagonal brace in. So that is that. And then these are your corner blocks and keystones, which help us solidify those joints, right? So a corner block goes here on the corner, and you run your plywood grain against the direction of the joint, right? So you have a joint, a little butt joint, right, between the rail across the top and the stile going down the edge. And then you run against the direction of that joint, the plywood grain, and that is to give it more strength in assembly, okay? And then you have a keystone, and that will cover the joint between the vertical of the stile and the toggle, and similarly will strengthen it, right? And the word keystone is coming from this concept in construction of archways made of stones, which is that there's that stone at the top that locks everything together and keeps the whole thing from falling out. And if you pull that stone out, the whole arch will collapse, right? The keystone holds that toggle in place. So with a hard covered flat, right, we are not needing corner blocks and keystones, and that's because we have a whole sheet of plywood that's keeping the frame square, okay? But we are also, and we are also using that 1x3 on edge, okay? So that you have a thinner framing piece based on the front of the flat, and you have more surface area to attach those flats together, right? So you take one Hollywood flat, you set it up next to the next Hollywood flat, you attach those together, and you have two pieces that work as one unit, and that's really the convenience of a Hollywood flat, right? Whereas in order to do that with those soft covered flats, you have to do more structure in order to be able to attach them together, okay? So now let's talk about, here we go. Notice corner blocks and keystones are not needed because the hard facing keeps the unit square. Yes, so when you are constructing your hard covered flats, they are more efficient for us in terms of creating windows and doors, things like that, because you don't have to frame as much when you have already that hard covering to support things, okay? So as you look at your specific flat that you're given, you'll see different dimensions. You'll have an overall height, you'll have heights of openings, things like that. And then you would go in as the carpenter and create what's called a cut list, which we'll talk about in a minute, in order to construct it, okay? Sometimes you have to do a seam right here, like this face. That's very small. Let me see if I can make that bigger. Ooh. This is what happens when you edit the thing while you're doing the presentation. What? So if you look at this particular flat, right, it's 10 feet tall. As we know, our sheet stock, it only comes 4 feet by 8 feet. And so that means we need to create two pieces. We need to use two pieces of Luan to do the covering of this flat, right? We can't fit this all inside of one sheet of Luan. And in order to make that happen, we need a framing piece that will cover the seam between those two pieces of Luan. Otherwise, they're gonna go wonky if it's floating in space, right? That plywood is gonna get bendy at some point, especially if you start painting it, it's gonna warp. And then you will no longer have that perfect seam with the smooth face on it that looks like it's one solid piece of drywall, right? Which is always the goal. We want it to look like it's just a regular wall. So in order to support that seam, we place a 1x3 on face, and that's this, right? So your 3/4 inches doesn't give you enough space to staple on both sides of that seam opening, but your 2 5/8 inch, right, or 2.5 inch 1x3s do give you enough space on that face to attach both pieces of Luan to that one piece of wood. And so that is how we frame a Hollywood flat when it needs to be taller than our given cover material can handle, okay? So that's just like an extra level of complexity, right? And you'll notice here, it says the center line indicates the center or the middle of the board, right? So that piece on face needs to be centered on the part of the seam, right? The part of the frame where that seam would happen between the one sheet of Luan and the other sheet of Luan, okay? And you write face on it in order to indicate that it is 90 degrees, so it's on face with the framing. Okay, cool. Here's another example, right, of how that works, right? So if we have a nice tall flat, we would have the framing of the top, the framing of the sides, and we would have those pieces on face to allow extra bite for these three covers to cover the front of that flat, right? You might have a similar situation here where because we have an 8-foot flat, so it would fit within that 8-foot flat, but it's 6 feet wide. So that's more than the 4 feet we have available. And so the most efficient way to cover it would be to use 2'6" by 6 foot panels for the top and the bottom, and then these littler panels to fill in over each side of the window, okay? So this construction strategy stuff, it should be figured out by your technical director. When you're a carpenter, you should be able to come in and build it. But it's good to sort of think through how you would construct and cover a flat as you're either designing, right? Especially if you're a designer. If there are ways you can make your designs more efficient to build, that's always a plus. Or if you can use more stock materials, more flats that already exist in the stock, then you're going to save money on construction, and that's a great thing to do, and it's a way to make friends with your shops and also your producers. And then the other side of it too is that sometimes you're going to build your own stuff. Like, that's the whole point. So understanding why those drawings are drawn in such a way is really helpful too. Okay, so now let's talk about the cut list. The cut list is a complete list of lengths of material needed to build the project, right? So if you're handed this drawing, right, then the first thing you're going to do when you go build it is you're going to be like, okay, my rails, my stiles, my toggles, my other framing pieces, how many of each length do I need of each material, right? So that I can go cut all of those pieces first. And then once I've cut them all and I have a stack of wood, I'll come in and actually lay out the frame and assemble it, okay? So we start by creating this cut list. We're gonna cut the raw stick lumber to the appropriate lengths in order to build the frame. And before we cut it, we make a list of it. And this is like the step before measure twice, cut once, right? When we actually go to cut lumber, we want to make that measurement twice so that we are double checking we've got it right before we start cutting into the wood so we don't make mistakes. Let's start with an example cut list for this soft covered flat, okay? So I have a soft covered flat. The width of my flat will be 2'6". The height of my flat will be 5'6". And the stick lumber we're using is 1x3. Our stick 1x3 is going to have an actual dimension, right? Remember, nominal dimensions are the name that you call out at the store or in the shop. The actual dimensions are less than that due to the milling process. So we're going to say our actual dimensions are 3/4 of an inch by 2.5 inches. Sometimes that 2.5 will be slightly different depending on the material. So you want to go measure your actual stick lumber before you start. But since you are stuck in a computer and not in the shop, we're going to give ourselves actual dimensions 3/4 by 2.5 inches. And now let's write out this cut list. I've printed it out for you. There it is. I'm gonna turn my camera. Let me get ready. Okay. This is not drawn to scale. It's cool. Be chill. But let's say I come into the shop. I'm handed this drawing, right, of this flat, and I need to know what dimensions of wood I need to cut everything to. And this is where your shop math comes in handy, right? This is where we get into that again. So the first thing I need to know is I have rails and stiles, right? Remember? So rails, stiles. I have 2 of each. So let's start with this top one. And that is, I know, 2'6" long, right? And I have 1, 2 of those at that length. So 2 at 2'6", Those are my rails. Okay. Then I have my stiles. And those will be this 5'6" length, right? That's the dimension I have, minus the width of that 1x3, right? So we remember given 1x3 equals 3/4 by 2.5. Okay, so we were given that. We also know that because this is a soft covered flat or a Broadway flat, these materials are on face. So we know that this dimension, right, this distance here is 2.5 inches. And in order to get this length of wood, right, this actual length of wood, we would subtract that 2.5 inches from each side, okay? And so 2.5 plus 2.5 equals 5, right? And then we subtract that from this 5'6". So 5'6" minus 5 inches equals 5'1", 2 stiles at 5'1". Okay. And then I have a toggle. Okay. So my toggle distance is going to be the 2'6" minus the 5 inches again, right? Because I have this width and that width. Okay. And 2'6" minus 5 inches is 2'1". Okay. So this right here is my cut list, right? If I have materials of different kinds, I break my cut list down, right? So if I'm going to be using 1x3 and 2x4, 1x3 and Luan plywood, I would have inside of that cut list, I would have those different things, right? Another thing that's really helpful if you have a big complicated flat, so like this one is super easy, but if it gets complicated, is to label each of these pieces with a letter, right? So if I say A, B, C, then then I write that on my cut list and I write it on my wood. As I'm cutting that wood, then I'll have like the IKEA building instructions, right, at the end, where I can be like, oh, right, I need piece A, I need to join that to piece B, piece C is going to go in the center, etc. And so that's a good way to plan your project if you have a complicated cut list, so that you're able to find which piece goes where when you come back to build it, okay? So that is a soft covered flat example. So now let's do the hard covered flat example list, right? So for this one, our stick lumber is again 1x3 with actual dimensions of 3/4 inch by 2.5 inches. And we also, because it's a hard covered flat, we need a cover for it. So we need a piece of Luan that is the right dimensions to cover the face of the flat, okay? So let's look at the math on this guy. All right, so we have a hard covered flat. Great. Let's start once again with our rails, right? So 2 at 3 foot, 0 inches. Great. And then we'll do our stiles. Now this time our stiles, you'll see, right? Everything is on edge. So instead of that 2.5 dimension to subtract from the total height, we're going to subtract that 3/4 inch, right? So we would take 3/4 inch off the top, 3/4 inch off the bottom. 3/4 plus 3/4 equals 6/4 equals 1 and 2/4 equals 1.5. That's a whole math problem there, right? So we're subtracting 1.5 inches from the total height of the flat in order to get the height of just the stile. Okay? And so I need to say 6 foot, 0 inches minus 1.5 inches. Take that down to 5 feet, make this 12. Take it down to 11, right? 2 out of 2. And we get 1/2 11 minus 1, 10 and a half, 5 foot, 10 and a half inches. We have 2 stiles at 5 foot, 10 and a half inches. And then we have a toggle, once again, here in the center. And that toggle is going to be the 3 feet minus 3/4 plus 3/4 minus 1.5 inches. Two foot, 10 and a half inches. One toggle at 2 foot, 10 and a half inches. This is 1 by 3. Then I need Luan, right? The plywood cover. And that is going to be 6 feet, 0 inches by 3 foot, 0 inches, 1 at that length. Okay. So then this is now our cut list for that hard covered flat. Okay? Great. So your task, your assignment, this is due on Friday, is to do your own practice cut lists for each of these soft covered and hard covered flats that are given. Okay? So if you are given a soft covered flat, so we just did it as a hard covered flat, but if you're given a soft covered flat that's 6 feet by 3 feet, what lengths of wood do you need in order to construct it? And then similarly, if you are given a hard covered flat that is 3'6" by 7'9", what lengths of wood are needed to construct that? And so that is our practice. And then next week when we come into lab or Zoom class, etc., we will actually use the scale lumber that you were provided to practice this kind of constructions. Okay? So that's our game. Thanks so much. I will talk to you all soon. Bye.